People today turn on the heater, shut the doors, thicken the walls, and still say it is cold. Out on the old plains, the wind did not blow. It scraped the ground. The earth was not soft. It froze into stone. When firewood ran low and the flames sank, most of us would panic. They did not. Here is the part that sounds impossible. They saved their last pieces of wood by using the coldest thing around them. They turned the ground into a heater, a thin layer of frost on top, warm soil waiting under it, just enough to hold the night. That is how they made it through without burning more wood, and how they learned to read the land better than the storm itself. Out on the plains, the ground froze hard enough to ring under a boot. The top layer was ice, but just 5 or 10 centimeters under it, the soil stayed warmer than the air. Most people never think about that. Cold air steals heat faster than cold earth. That is the part nobody expects. When they lay straight on frozen ground, their body heat bled out fast. Back, shoulders, hips, gone in minutes. And a fire had to work twice as hard to replace it. The old families knew better. They read the land the way others read the sky. So they dug a shallow pit no deeper than a hand, 10 to 15 centimeters. Just enough to reach that steady layer of warm soil under the frost. Then they built their sleeping floor inside it. Grass, dry earth, a hide on top. Simple, but it stopped the cold from pulling the heat out of their backs. University of Wyoming tests in 2013 proved it. The subsurface stayed warmer, more stable. A natural buffer the air could not touch. By using that hidden warmth, they could save as much as 25 to 30% of the wood they would have burned through the night. No fancy trick, no miracle, just knowing the ground better than the storm. They did not fight the earth, they used it. A slow, steady heater under their bodies, and the first step in turning frozen land into a source of warmth. Cold nights on the plains had one rule. When the fire died, the warmth died with it. The wind took whatever was left. But the old families learned something most of us overlook. Stone holds heat longer than wood, and when you bury that heat under the ground, it slows down even more. In the 1936 Smithsonian Tipis heat study, they heated river stones until they glowed faint red. Then they buried them in a shallow layer of soil inside the lodge, a thin cover of earth. Grass, a hide on top. Nothing fancy, just a quiet heater under their bodies. Digging up old Lakota and Pawnee camps, archaeologists found long streaks of burned earth, thin red veins running under the floor, signs the stones had cooked the soil night after night. And it worked. Stone and earth kept their warmth for 6 to 8 hours, long after the flames had disappeared, long enough to stop the cold from stealing heat off their backs, and long enough to save a pile of firewood every single night. Most of us today think heat comes from the flame. They knew heat could come from the ground. You did not need a big fire. You needed a floor that understood how to hold on to warmth, a slow, steady bed of earth and stone, a heater that did not make a sound, and it was the kind of warmth that carried them through nights when the wind showed no mercy. A fire in a storm burns fast, too fast. The heat rises and disappears into the dark, and the cold pulls everything back down. But the old builders understood something simple. The fire pit was not just a place to burn wood. It was a battery, a slow heat bank built into the ground. In the Mandan and Hidatsa excavation of 1939, archaeologists found a shallow ring around the hearth, 5 to 8 centimeters deep, packed with ash and burned soil. A circle of heat trapped in the ground. When they lit a fire, the embers and falling ash slid into that ring. The earth soaked up every bit of warmth, inches at a time, quiet, steady. And when the flames died, the ground kept working. That ring stayed warm long after the last spark faded, warm enough to push heat back into the lodge, warm enough to save the wood they would have thrown on the fire. Most people think the fire is the only source of heat. They knew the ground could carry the load. A warm floor means less wood. A warm ring means the cold cannot steal heat through the dirt. It spreads the warmth evenly, inch by inch. No drafts, no sudden drops. Luatat. But the ground keeps going. A silent partner doing the heavy lifting when the storm tries to take everything. And this small ring of earth was one of the first ways they turned frozen soil into something that could keep a family alive. Most of us think ash means the fire is done, cold, useless. But to the old families, ash was a shield, a thin gray layer that kept the wind from stealing what little heat remained. In the 1954 Crease subarctic fire study, they learned that spreading a light coat of ash over the coals slowed the oxygen down, just enough to keep the embers alive, just enough to keep the heat from leaking into the night. It worked like this. Ground wind moves low. It slides across the dirt and rips the heat out of any open coal. But when you cover those coals with ash, the wind hits a wall. A soft wall, but a real one. Under that ash, the embers stay red longer. They burn slow, steady, and the heat sinks into the ground instead of disappearing into the air. The result surprised even the researchers. In some tests, the coals lasted half again as long. That meant as much as 30 to 40% less firewood burned each night. All because of a handful of ash most people would throw away. You can still picture it. A thin sheet of gray resting over the coals. Quiet, still, a small blanket for the last heat of the fire. Wood lives off flame, but the ground lives off ash. That was the rule they trusted when the wind scraped low and the night refused to give back a single degree of warmth. And it was one more step in turning cold earth into a steady, silent source of heat. Most people brush ash aside, call it waste, call it the end of the fire. But out on the plains, ash was armor, a natural layer of insulation that kept the cold from clawing into the coals. The old families learned early that a bare fire burns through wood too fast. The heat rises, the wind steals the rest, and the flames die long before the night does. So they used what most of us would throw away. A thin coat of ash, just enough to dim the oxygen, just enough to keep the embers alive under the gray. Ash blocks the low wind that scrapes across the ground. Ash traps the slow heat in the coals. Ash pushes that warmth down into the earth instead of letting it drift into the dark. The difference was real. A single layer kept the red glow alive 30 to 40% longer. Less wood burned, more heat held. A small trick with a big payout on nights the storm refused to let up. Picture it, a faint red line under a blanket of dull gray. Soft, still, but working harder than the fire itself. Wood needs flame to live, but the ground lives off ash. Once they understood that, everything changed. The fire no longer ran the show. The earth did. A handful of ash saved a pile of wood. A quiet shield turning a fragile fire into a slow, steady source of warmth. A simple move, but one that kept families alive when the night pressed in and the cold didn't give an inch. A bare ember never lasts long. Not in winter, not on open ground. The wind crawls low and pulls the heat straight out of it. The old families knew that. They felt it every night, so they used a trick most people today would never think of. In the Navajo night warmth accounts from 1912, families buried their embers shallow, just a thin cover of earth, 1 or 2 centimeters, no deeper than a thumb. It changed everything. First, they burned the wood down to clean red coals. Then they spread the embers out, even, quiet, hot enough to matter, but not wild like flame. Then came the step that saved the night. They pulled a handful of earth and laid it over the coals. A thin skin, nothing more. Enough to hide the glow from the wind, but not enough to smother it. After that, they covered the spot with dry grass or a piece of hide. The cold could not reach it, the wind could not bite it, and the ember core burned slow under the soil. A deep, steady burn, all night long. That heat bled downward, warming the ground from the inside. The earth became a quiet heater, a slow, patient warmth under the sleeping floor, and they did not need to feed the fire again. No new wood, no worry about sparks, just a hidden furnace working under the dirt. You can picture it clearly, a faint red heart buried under a thin layer of frost. Still alive, still warm, doing the work the fire could not finish. A small layer of earth turned those embers into an underground stove. A simple move, but one that kept them alive on nights the cold refused to give an inch. Air cools fast, too fast to trust, but the ground cools slow, slow enough to matter. That truth shaped the way the old families built their warmth. They did not rely on the fire alone. They relied on the earth beneath it. In the 1970 Smithsonian teepee reconstruction, researchers found something unexpected. Even with a small fire, the lodge floor could reach 68 to 72 degrees. A warm ground under a cold roof. Heat that did not drift away. The secret was simple. Every night of burning left behind a little more ash, more warmed soil, more stones holding yesterday's heat. Layer after layer, the ground turned into a thermal bank, a slow battery storing warmth from one night to the next, a floor that got warmer with use instead of colder. Here is how it worked. They kept the old ash, they kept the red earth, they kept the stones that had cooked under the fire. Nothing was thrown out. Everything stayed in the floor. Over time, the soil held heat longer than the flames. The teepee warmed from the bottom up, and the fire needed less wood every night. A radiant ground zone, silent, steady. A long-term heater sitting right under their feet. Most people today would never believe it. Nobody thinks frozen earth can outlast fire, but it can, and it did. The ground became the safest source of heat. Not bright like flame, not loud like wind, just a slow warmth rising from below. A warmth you could trust when the night dropped hard and the storm refused to ease. They had no metal, no stoves, no gear built to fight the cold. What they had was earth, ash, stone, and a way of watching how heat moved through all three. Those tricks did not look like much. A shallow pit, a thin coat of ash, a handful of warm soil under the sleeping floor. Small moves, light enough to carry in your hands. But they saved families when the wind showed no mercy, because each trick slowed the cold down. Each one held the heat a little longer, and each one meant they burned less wood on nights when wood was running out. Most people today try to fight winter head on. Bigger fires, more fuel, more noise. But the old families read the ground instead of forcing it. They listened to the way warmth settled. They paid attention to the way cold crawled. The wisdom they used weighed nothing. No tools, no heavy packs, just knowledge. Simple, sharp, earned the hard way. They did not battle the earth. They made it an ally. And once the ground became part of the system, everything changed. The fire no longer carried the whole burden. The soil carried it with them. Slow heat, steady heat, heat that did not blow away when the storm pushed low across the plains. You can picture those nights, the flames sinking, the coals dimming, the wind chewing at the outside walls, and yet the ground stayed warm, quiet, holding the last of the heat when the fire barely had any left to give. That is how they lived through the kind of nights we call impossible. Not by force, by understanding the land under their feet. The fire always fades first. It drops to a thin red line. The lodge goes quiet, but the ground stays warm. Slow heat holding steady under the hides. The kind of warmth you don't notice until the wind scratches at the walls. That was their safety. Not the flame, not the sparks. The earth, the ash, the stones they used night after night until the floor itself knew how to keep heat. Most people today trust only what they can see, but out there, the real heat was under their feet, working in silence long after the fire gave up. And that is the lesson that remains. When the fire fades, the ground does not. It keeps doing the quiet work that saved them through the hardest nights. Stay by the fire.